Welcome into the latest episode of the Unpaid Interns. I'm Austin Render here. It's Monday, September 14th. So glad you could join us on today's episode. And today we have a very special guest from out on the West Coast. He is Kyle Bonagura. Am I saying that right? I
You
guess I
got it.
should. Bonagura from ESPN. He covers college athletics for ESPN. We're so happy to have him here along with us. And Kyle, I want to get things started, I guess, by talking about the first quote unquote real big week of football that we saw this week with a lot of the big names playing. I know there were some conferences missing and it just felt weird. What was the strangest part to you turning on football this past weekend?
Yeah, as someone who is on the West Coast and has watched Pac-12, Pac-10 football basically my entire life, not having that was easily the weirdest part of my day, right? Because I'm used to, staying up until, well past midnight on the West Coast, putting the day's coverage to bed and spending a lot of time with the Pac-12 team. So without them to pay attention to, it was certainly a weird experience.
Yeah, it was weird here as well with no Big Ten football going on. I watched a little bit of it. Weird to see Notre Dame playing just up the road and not having anything here in Bloomington. You mentioned it, you tweeted about it, how much you missed the Pac-12 after dark. I mean, we can get into logistics of why it's not happening here in a bit, but what makes the Pac-12 after dark so special? I mean, I'm someone who likes to stay up and watch it. What is the magic about Pac-12 after dark?
There's a science to it. No, I don't know. It's just so it's basically expect the unexpected is probably a good motto for Pac-12 after dark. You just see a lot of weird stuff happen. We're talking Hail Marys, we're talking about multiple laterals. We're talking about just anything that can go wrong and be entertaining is what to expect during Pac-12 after dark. And it's cool too because the rest of the country is done playing. And by the time the Pac-12 was playing its night game, it's usually, there's usually only one or two games going on. So it unites the college football obsessed people all over the country. Like if you're watching Pac-12 football, after midnight, after a full day of games, you're really dedicated to the sport too. So it's kind of serves as a gathering place for some of the most diehard fans in the country, in addition to just the people who are fans of whatever Pac-12 teams are happy to be playing on any given night.
Yeah, I mean, it's usually one of those things you just have on. You're like, oh, cool, it's Pac-12 after dark. At least for someone who lives in Indiana, I think I know where most fans sit on this, but I want to pick your brain. Watching the other conferences play, do you feel it's worse that those conferences have gone full steam ahead? They're just gonna go, they're gonna play, or do you think it's worse that someone like the Pac-12 or the Big Ten has decided, you know what, we're not going to play? Where do you think the worst line, and maybe we don't know where it is yet, but who's taking the right path, do you think, right now?
Yeah, I don't think either of us are really qualified to make that determination, right? Because there's so much unknown with the virus and what's the best protocol to move forward. I mean, you have a lot of very smart people who settled on different courses of action. So for anyone who's not trained in epidemiology or infectious diseases, it's tough to say. I will say that I think that the college athletic departments and conferences have done a good job mitigating risks for the players who are gonna move forward. And I don't think we've seen any proof that the teams that are playing football are significantly more at risk than the conferences that aren't playing. Right? It's not like it's a binomial deal where if you play, your exposure is significant, and if you don't play, you're going to be fine, because we've already seen several teams that have that are part of the conferences who are not playing players contract the virus, right? So this isn't a clear cut answer. I think that what you're going to see from the Big Ten and the Pac-12 is once they do start playing, and I think that's pretty clear that at some point it'll resume. When we'll see. I think they've positioned themselves to be in, kind of in a spot to move forward more smoothly once they do start. I mean, we've seen several postponements and cancellations already at places where the proper protocols just weren't ready yet, right? And because the Pac-12's access to daily testing should, once the conference gets going, it should theoretically move, pretty well, right? So I think that's something to be said about that. What's better for the fan or obviously starting with a normal schedule is preferred, right? Being part of the larger college football discussion is better as a form of entertainment. But as far as taking all the other factors into play, I think you're going to wind up with people just looking at it very differently. Like you can make the case that the SEC is moving forward with the best possible roadmap, and you could make the same case for the Pac-12. I think you're going to see a lot of regionality with it. People who are fans of the SEC will be adamant that their conference is doing it the right way, and you'll see that everywhere else in the country, maybe maybe except outside of the Big Ten, where
Yeah.
no one is impressed with the way that they've proceeded with all this.
No, we'll get to that in a moment, but you mentioned the daily testing that the Pac-12 has started to get going here. They've signed the deal and have that in the future. What are you hearing about how that could impact sports coming back in October, November, and a possible timeline for Pac-12's resuming?
Yeah, so the daily testing machines that the Pac-12 teams will have access to aren't expected to arrive on campus until the end of this month. Let's just assume that they'll be operational in early October. Once those are operational, it's still TBD on what the timeline will be, but most Pac-12 teams are adamant that you need kind of a 6-week lead up, right, of practicing, and they're not there yet. So let's say that the daily testing is in place in early October. Call it the first week of October, just to make it easy. Call it 6 weeks from there, puts you at middle of November, right? Maybe you can figure out a way to cut that back and make it the beginning of November. That's the earliest that it'll happen in the Pac-12. I don't see any circumstance that would allow for the Pac-12 to start earlier than early November, and it's likely mid to late November is more realistic. And then it's still within the realm of possibility that it's not till after the new year, because the element that the Pac-12 is dealing with that other places in the country aren't is there are local ordinances that are preventing gatherings, right? And so right now in California and Oregon, those teams aren't allowed to gather and practice like you can in other parts of the state. So if you have until the state governments and the local governments amend their current restrictions to allow for the Pac-12 teams in those areas to play, you can't start, right? So you're waiting on a number of different factors, and trying to get that completely sorted out of what the exact timeline will be is kind of a fool's errand at this point.
Yeah, I think you answered one of my questions here. That I wondered if the Big Ten were, and who knows, the Big Ten just seems to be everywhere at this point. If they were to come back, let's say mid-October, I was going to ask if you think the Pac-12 would attempt to come back with them, but it doesn't sound like that's really feasible.
No, I think the Pac-12 would like to start at the same time as the Big Ten, but I don't think the Big Ten cares if it's in line with the Pac-12, right? The Big Ten's preference, as the way I understand it, is that they would like to get it started or sooner rather than later, with an attempt to salvage the conference's participation in the larger college football picture, right? If you have, the teams that are still eligible for the college football playoff in the Big Ten, that seems like the goal here, reading the tea leaves. And I don't spend much time dealing with the Big Ten's machinations on a day-to-day basis, but I do know that the Pac-12 would prefer to be in line with the Big Ten, because that allows for some postseason games, right? If you could have a spring Rose Bowl or a winter Rose, like whatever it might be, without if the Pac-12 isn't on a similar schedule to the Big Ten, it takes some of those one-off scenarios out of the equation, and you're looking at just a Pac-12 only season. It's basically an exhibition, right? And you can joke that the Pac-12 hasn't participated in the playoff with any degree of regularity, so it's what's the difference, right? But then you're not having even these one-off bowl games that could be in play if you were kind of doing it at the same time as another conference.
It is crazy that the Big Ten and the Pac-12 both canceled at very similar times, and the Big Ten has just gotten so much more backlash. And I know there's reasoning behind that, but what has the Pac-12 done better to kind of avoid some of that backlash that the Big Ten got immediately?
So the most obvious thing that they did differently was on the day that the Pac-12 announced it was postponing, it provided a 12-page medical, report that outlined the steps, their medical committee's understanding about what needed to be in place for a season to happen. And they weren't close to being able to meet those requirements. And so they had an explanation, right? And of course, people are going to disagree about if that was valid or not, but at least they provided reasoning for why they can't move forward. And part of it, again, was the local restrictions as well. Like the Pac-12 couldn't have started. I mean, they still can't start as far as, because of the what's being allowed on the government side of things, right? And so in a way, their hand was played for them. And they, on the same day, they made the conference commissioner available. They made the head of the medical team available, and they had the president of the University of Oregon, who leads the Pac-12 CEO group, the governing body for the Pac-12. All three of those people were available in a Zoom press conference, and it was a significant, maybe 45 minutes or so. So they answered a lot of questions and provided some context and clarity about why the decision was made. The Big Ten just kind of threw his hands up and said it's not happening, and kind of went dark for a while, whatever, however many days it was, right? And because they went dark and didn't answer questions, it it opened them up to criticism, right? Because they didn't explain the decision in a way that, they didn't explain it at all, let alone with, with questions, fielding questions from reporters and all of that. But I think the other part of that maybe doesn't get as much, isn't discussed as much, is that Pac-12 football and Big Ten football are very different in terms of what they mean culturally, right? The Big Ten has a significantly bigger fan base than the Pac-12. The Pac-12 has fans. It's a big deal, right, for the people who are involved. But as far as how it fits into, social culture on the West Coast is not similar to how it is in the Big Ten. So people, out here we're always going to be less upset that they're losing Pac-12 football than people, now this isn't a one size fits all, but for the most part, right? It means more to Big Ten football means more to the Midwest than Pac-12 football does to the West Coast. That's just a fact. I've lived here my whole life and spent a lot of time with the Pac-12. That's just the way it is, right? And so when you have more invested fans, who are going to be upset about not having their beloved sport to watch, it's going to make an impact too, right? So that has to be that's part of it, and I think it's been interesting to see how that's played out. So it's the combination of those two factors have really kind of got us to where we're at.
Yeah, nobody's out there at the Pac-12 storming the commissioner's house or suing the conference or anything like
Right.
that. So they've handled it a little better on the
They
West
kind of just
Coast.
move on with their day, right?
Exactly. And even if they are to come back, and they presumably will at some point, both conferences, do you expect a lot of the bigger names at some of these marquee places, some of the guys, and we've already seen it in the ACC, the SEC, the big names who are expected to go high in the NFL draft? Do you think we'll see more and more of those guys opting out of any sort of potential season these conferences come up with?
Yeah, I think that's fair to expect. I mean, we're even seeing it today. I want to say I saw someone from the ACC opted out today. Maybe that's wrong. My point is, like, it's going to happen everywhere. It's going to happen in
Mm.
the Pac-12. It's going to happen in the Big Ten. It's going to happen even in the conferences that are committed to playing a somewhat of a regular schedule, right? I think just the oddness of this entire season is going to that's a foregone conclusion. Oregon has 3 or 4 guys that have already done it. Penei Sewell is the number 2 overall prospect according to Mel Copper Jr., right? And he's already announced that he's not going to play. That's just going to be the new norm. And I'm wondering now too, is now that we're seeing it happen, are you going to see in future years, even when the virus isn't really part of the equation, are you going to see juniors who are big time prospects opt out as well? I don't know. I think we've kind of opened up that door as a possibility, and we'll see if it ends up playing out that way.
I mean, it started with bowl games, and maybe it's just going to, like you said, evolve into bigger things. As someone who lives, and I live in the Midwest, you're a West Coast, you're a big Pac-12 guy. Around here, it feels like, and whether this is right or not, the Pac-12 finds itself kind of at the butt of a lot of jokes as a conference. Do you think that is fair with their lack of representation, or what would you say to counter some of the people who may not understand the realm of Pac-12 sports?
Yeah, I mean, listen, the Pac-12 kind of set itself up for a lot of this, right? And you can the jokes are most of the jokes are actually pretty funny, right? There's a lot of bad ones too, but like they're justified in terms of how the Pac-12 factors into the larger picture, right? And the Pac-12 hasn't had a team that's competed for a national title in a very long time, right? It's, those Oregon teams were there and they were close, never got over the hill. USC obviously had its great run, but it's been a while since you've seen, Pac-12 teams routinely compete at the highest level of the sport. And until that happens again, the Pac-12 is going to be the butt of jokes, and that's fine. That's just kind of how sports works, right? If the ACC didn't have Clemson, if Clemson hadn't been booing the ACC for the last several years, the ACC would be in a very similar spot. But right now, because Clemson, basically guarantees that the ACC will be in the national title picture on an annual basis, and Florida State was there before that, not too long ago. It's making up for what the rest of the rest of the conference is pretty bad, right? So that's kind of where the Pac-12 really needs USC to get back, because USC should be much better than it is. It's got all the infrastructure in place to be a national power. There's no real excuse for why it isn't. And the moment USC kind of gets back on track, I think the Pac-12 will be kind of validated again, because when the Pac-12 when USC was good, the Pac-12 got trickle down respect. But without a team like that, that's just not going to happen. And throw in the they're not playing right now, you're going to get the Pac-12 is soft, they don't care about it, which is like, again, like I understand where people are coming from with that. Doesn't make the people who are invested heavily in Pac-12 football any less committed to it than other places of the country? No, right? Because you just have a smaller number of people who care at the same level as other places of the country. But the people who are invested in, the coaches, the players, I mean, they're as invested in what they're doing as people all over the country.
It does feel like the conference needs someone bigger than like a Washington to contend, because you get Washington and nobody really watches a Washington game, but USC would be that way. When they do come back, who do you see as the favorite in the Pac-12 to maybe make the most noise this season?
Yeah, that's a very good question, right? Because it's there. I don't know if they're Oregon is the clear favorite, but how good would they be on a national, in the national picture? I don't know. And especially now we've seen them lose some of their best players, right? And so I don't have any idea how to predict what a Pac-12 season would look like when we don't know who's going to be playing, who's going to opt in, who's going to opt out. We didn't have spring football. We didn't have any training camp to learn more about, these teams. So I do bowl projections for ESPN, and it's always just ridiculous to try to project bowl games that are several months in the future. Man, it's even harder this year to trying to get a sense of how these teams are going to be, just because you just have so little information to go with. And so, Oregon by default, but again, like, you can't feel confident about any sort of predictions in the Pac-12 this year with just no information to go on.
That's a tough gig. Bowl game predictions in a year where we don't even know how many games people are going to play this year.
There's more bowl slots than there's teams playing.
Yeah, what's going to
year.
qualify you for a bowl game? I mean, some
And
conferences are playing 10, some conferences are playing 8. That'll be interesting. I do want to shift while I have you to your journalism career a little bit. Kind of pick your brain on how you've got to where you are. You're a West Coast guy. You've worked there out in the West, many different capacities. How did you first get your foot in the door when you graduated from Washington State?
So I was lucky because when I was in high school, I was writing for a local paper and I was covering high school football. I started doing that when I was a sophomore in high school. And so I'd, Friday night, go out to a high school game, drive back to the office and file, a 8-inch story, which is, maybe few hundred words. So I had the relationships in place at that paper, which was the paper was the Tri-Valley Herald, which was part of then the ANG newspaper chain, which the headliner at that point was the Oakland Tribune. And so I kind of lucked into a part-time high school sports job. I was working 24 hours a week, getting paid $12 an hour, working in probably 80 hours a week just to kind of, learn as much as I could. And kind of just slowly, that progressed. I left there. I went to a website called patch.com, which was like a startup news site around 2010 or so. Spent a year at CBS Sports covering Stanford. Then I did the Niners for a year, parlayed that into a freelance job covering the Warriors for what's now NBC Sports Bay Area for their website, and started freelancing at ESPN in 2012. And so I freelanced there for about 2 years before it turned into a staff job. And so I've been doing college sports. This is my seventh year, I think.
So what is the life of a freelancer? You kind of are in the door, but kind of explain to those who may not understand what is life like when you're freelancing for someone?
Yeah, it's tough. Freelancing's tough because you're getting paid on a per story basis. And sometimes you can come to an agreement where you'll have a consistent freelancing gig, right? Where they'll guarantee you X amount of stories a week or a month for this much money, right? That's not how it was with me at ESPN initially. It was like when they needed help covering a game, I would help out. But before, like when I was at CBS and when I was at NBC Sports Bay Area, those were freelance gigs where I was writing consistently for them, but it wasn't like I was on a salary, right? I was getting paid either a stipend per week, which was the case at CBS. And then at NBC, I was getting paid per story. And then you're still searching for other freelance gigs. So that's not enough to, that's not a living wage. At least it wasn't at that point. And, it's rare to be able to do a sports freelancing without piecing together a lot of different pieces to kind of get by. Like when I was freelancing, I was working as a Lyft driver in San Francisco. Also, I, did odd jobs just to get by and kind of keep my career moving forward and buy myself some time to continue to get more experience in journalism, hoping that eventually I would get a break. And luckily it came. But I worked at like a software company doing social media there on the side. I had to do a lot of different things to kind of keep pushing forward, because even 8-10 years ago, journalism jobs were very hard to come by. It's an even more difficult climate now to get into it. So you got to make a lot of sacrifices to make this career work.
Well, you've made it to ESPN, like you said, your seventh year covering college sports there. And what's kind of that experience been like now that you're firmly in at ESPN? And was that kind of growing up a dream destination for you?
It's funny you mentioned dream destination, because I don't know if you remember, you're maybe a little bit too young for this, but there was a show called ESPN Dream Job, and it was a
Yes.
reality show where
I am
ESPN
too
was
young for it, but my parents have told me about it.
okay. So I actually tried out for that show when I was in high school. Like I was 18 years old, so I was like barely able to even try out. I went to San Francisco for an audition with a friend of mine, and it was fun. We had no dreams that it was going to turn into anything. We just thought it would be a fun experience. But yeah, so I tried out for ESPN Dream Job when I was 18 in high school. And ESPN's been a great place to work. I mean, there's no one more committed to sports in the United States, if not the world. It's a great team that I work with. Our editors and reporters are all great people, very talented at what they do. And I couldn't have hoped for a better place to end up.
Well, this is quite an interesting time for all people in the sports industry. When everything kind of went black back in March and we lost all of our sports and nothing was going on live wise, how did you try to stay creative and keep bringing the content and keep creating stories that people were clicking on?
Yeah, so a lot of it has been just very news heavy, right? So that if it there in a way there's actually been more to write about on a news side, right? Because there was like important developments about the future of the sport that were in such a weird time. Spent a lot of time learning about the virus's impact on sports. I had a big story that ran a couple weeks ago that showed um, using cell phone data how fans distribute to their communities following college football games, which is a cool piece to work on. Started doing a little bit of soccer stuff to help out our soccer team as well. So it's really finding outside the box stuff. It's that stuff can be more fun to work on anyways. Like you get into, at least when I got into sports writing, it's like, oh, I just wanted X's and O's, like talk about the game and all of that. But the more time you spend doing this, the more the off the field, off the beaten trail stuff interests me, right? Because everyone can watch the game and tell you about what happened in the game. There's conflicting opinions, and that's fun, right? The armchair stuff, just debating sports with your friends. There's always going to be kind of an audience for that. But you can get that anywhere. You can get that from your friends, and it might be more valuable than it would be from someone on ESPN or whatever channel it might be. So that's why I like to try to find the stuff that you can't find other places. Like, why would I read this story? Oh, because you can't get it anywhere else. You're going to learn something here that you're not going to learn just if you're just browsing the internet randomly, right? So I do try to find stories like that educate and inform and are different is kind of how I've tried to work the last, really a year, even before the pandemic blew everything up.
What's a story that stands out to you in your career that was kind of either crazy, something that you had to go into great depth to kind of unveil some details in it, or maybe something that just was a fun story for you to do?
I mean, there's been several, but I'll go with a recent one just because it's fresh in my mind. I did a story last year about the Stanford Cal Axe, which is the rivalry trophy, right? And in I believe it was 1959, the axe was stolen. Part of like the tradition is like you try to steal the trophy, right? So the
Mhm.
Stanford axe was stolen in 1959 and was mysteriously vanished for several days. And the true story of what happened to the axe that day, or those days, I guess, never was revealed. But a guy who's in his 80s told the story on camera, like on a cell phone camera at a neighborhood party a few years ago, and it ended up on YouTube. And so I ended up piecing together this 6-decade-old mystery that had never been solved. Found a bunch of people who were involved in it, 60 years ago. Talked to a bunch of people who are, retirement homes in their 80s, really had no idea what had happened. So I pieced together this mystery about what happened this week in 1959 and told that story. It's a long story. I would encourage people to go check it out because it's actually a lot of fun. But stuff like that is fun, right? Because you're not gonna. Where else can you find an unsolved mystery from 60 years ago related to college football? Like those stories just don't pop up every day.
Well, I think every rivalry's got its own little stories, and it's fun to pull those out and kind of find the backstories behind them. Before I let you go, I know you have a heart out here. I see some of the ESPN mic flags behind you. The podcast mic kind of hanging down. Is this kind of been your at home studio here the past couple of months?
Yeah, I moved into a new house a couple months ago, and so I set up this mic here, and I got a little home office that works pretty well. When I do the TV stuff, I use that kind of as a backdrop for make it look a little bit more professional. But it's now I'm sitting in my chair and I'm able to look in my computer here with you. So this is do a lot of radio stuff on this, which has been good.
Hmm. We've all had to make little home studios, I guess, in a way here so far. I really appreciate you coming on. I'll let you go. But thanks so much for your time, Kyle. Best of luck as the Pac 12 tries to get things going here pretty soon. And thanks again for spending some of your time here.
Sure thing. Good luck with the show.
Thanks, Kyle.
All right. See ya.
That was Kyle Bonagura of ESPN joining us to talk a little Pac 12 college football and just about his journey as a journalist. Had a heart out there at 3 o'clock, so we had to let him go, but really appreciate his time. We've got a fun week of ESPN guests. I'll leave him in the dark. Wednesday's guest is a big guest, but because of what's going on in the college football landscape, we are still tentative on whether or not they will join us. So I'll keep their name hidden for the time being. You'll just have to join us at 10 a.m. on Wednesday to find out who that'll be. But we're really excited about the guests we have coming up this week. Really excited about Kyle joining us. He had to go there, so we ended up pushing back our intro segment and our headlines here until the end of the show. So let me go through a couple of the bigger stories. Obviously, we all experienced a full NFL Sunday, and we didn't lose any NFL to the pandemic, but it really did feel like it had been a long time since we had watched NFL football. Personally, it was great to sit on the couch all day and have football going. Unfortunately, my team, the Colts, stunk it up. And the news today, Marlon Mack is out for the season with a torn Achilles. Played not even 2 quarters of his season, not even a full half before tearing his Achilles, and he is done. So it makes the Colts pick of Jonathan Taylor that much more important. Picking him in the second round, now he and Naeem Hines will have to lead the Colts rushing attack. So we'll see how that changes the outlook of the season for the Colts, who just lost to the Jaguars yesterday. We referenced it a little bit in the chat with Kyle. The Big Ten had a meeting yesterday with the presidents and the higher ups of the universities. No vote came out of yesterday's conversations. Honestly, I don't think many of us expected it to. But from reports around the Big Ten, there is expected to be a vote at some point this week. That's kind of what we're waiting on. Uh, will it was 11-3 not to play the first vote. So you're looking at needing probably, from what I've heard, 8 teams. You would need an 8-week schedule probably, so maybe 9 teams would need to agree to it. And from some of the rumblings around the Big Ten, it does not sound like Michigan or Michigan State or Maryland will be opting into this season. A lot of these universities that are led by medical people, Northwestern as well, are very hesitant to reverse course and end up going back into college football. So even if the Big Ten does come back, it does not have to be unanimous. It just has to be majority. And with majority, that might mean that we don't see some familiar faces. We may not see Jim Harbaugh in Michigan. We may not see a new look Michigan State team. So we may not see Peyton Ramsey with Northwestern after he transferred from Indiana. So we'll kind of keep an eye on that. But that's kind of what I've picked up from looking around Twitter and the reports that have come out here the past couple of days. Expect a vote here this week. No idea when it'll be, not really a time frame on that, but from all reports, the Big Ten is expecting a revote at some time this week from the presidents of the universities to see what the plan is. Are we going to play football? Will it start in October? Will it start in November? Will it start in January? Those are the questions that have to be addressed by the Big Ten presidents here coming up this week. Also, and I wanted to address this because I've noticed this here over the past 4 days since the NFL kicked off on Thursday. And you've got the NBA playoffs going on. And yesterday, the Nuggets forced game 7 in an afternoon matinee with the Clippers that I felt like while following the NFL, I was watching the Colts throughout the afternoon, but following Twitter and the NFL, it felt like that NBA game, game 6, a competitive game, went almost unwatched because everyone's focusing on the NFL. And you've also got the NHL playoffs where the Dallas Stars are playing really well against the Vegas Knights and the Islanders are battling on the other side of things. And it's interesting that, and then you had the US Open tennis where Naomi Osaka wins and Daniel Thiem wins his first major championship. Osaka at age 22 has 3 major championships already. And it just like, even on Sports Equinox, which was Thursday night, and I think I talked about this on Friday, it's just the NFL you are seeing in these days where there are so many sports going on. You're seeing how much football is king. And I think I said it on the Friday episode. I thought maybe Thursday was just because it's the first game of the season. It's the Kansas City Chiefs. It's Patrick Mahomes. Of course, you're going to watch the opening day. And maybe that still is the case with the opening Sunday. But man, you follow along on Twitter on an NFL Sunday and you're not getting much information about Clippers Nuggets. You're not getting a lot of information about the men's tennis final at the US Open. And granted, that lost a lot of luster without Djokovic, Nadal, or Federer. You're not getting a lot of information about the NHL. The NHL has kind of been hit hard by all of this because I feel like some networks just do not even give it any attention, even in the midst of the conference finals. And it'll be interesting to see if that changes as the NFL season goes on. I think this is the first time my antennas are kind of going up in terms of paying attention to this. and just seeing how much the NFL runs the sports world. And the NBA is obviously a big organization, and they've done a great job with the bubble, but I just feel like they are squashed on a Sunday. If you're trying to do an afternoon game on a Sunday, if you're competing with the NFL, it's not going to work. And it's why the PGA Tour tried to, obviously before COVID, tried to move their schedule and make their biggest events before the NFL season started so that they're not competing on a Sunday afternoon coming down the stretch at the Tour Championship with an NFL Sunday. And that'll be the case. And it's the reason Fox had to give up their US Open rights for golf, because Fox will be covering the NFL here this Sunday. And obviously, the US Open begins Thursday. And there's also the Fox Thursday night game, Browns Bengals, on Thursday. So you'll see Fox will be all over the NFL. They gave it off to NBC, who will be doing the golf and then going right into Sunday night football on Sunday. But I'll be interested to see. It's obviously one of the this season six, but one of the three majors this year, and it's going to have to try and compete with an NFL Sunday, which majors don't typically have to do because the majors are normally in April, May, June, and July. So having a U.S. Open major championship butting heads with a NFL Sunday, I would imagine only the true golf fans like myself will be tuning in to NBC on Sunday to watch the golf. I just want to make that observation as I watched yesterday and followed along on social media how much the NFL just runs everything. There's so many sports going on. And I thought during the pandemic, I said, okay, as soon as sports come back, it's going to be great. We're going to have like 4 TVs going. We're going to have hockey and baseball. And I didn't even mention the MLB's going on right now. There was a no hitter yesterday. And that's just kind of taking a back seat to the NFL. But Alec Mills threw a no hitter for the Cubs yesterday. So you're thinking you're going to have baseball, hockey, football, all this stuff going on. And I tell you what, you fall into one sport, and when that's football, everything revolves around it. There's fantasy football. There's a reason that's the most played fantasy league. There's everyone bets on the NFL, and it just kind of runs the show. And that's what I've noticed here over the first week of NFL football. We'll see how week 2 goes, and if the NBA, as we get into the conference finals, if it's Clippers, Lakers, will start to get some more attention. That'll wrap things up here for our Monday episode. A bit shorter today, but we really appreciate Kyle Bonagura giving us some of his time from the West Coast. I had to push it back a little later. Obviously, 7 a.m. on the West Coast would have been a bit early for Kyle, so we pushed it back to the afternoon. We appreciate him coming on for half an hour with us. He gave a lot of great insight into what the Pac-12 is thinking as they head into a potential football season. And he also gave some really good insight into how to kind of push your way through this career and gave some good stories about his journalism career at ESPN and as a freelancer and beyond that. So make sure to check that out. You can check that. Plus our previous 47 episodes. We just had Brian Bennett of The Athletic on. Really good episode with him talking about the journalism field, The Athletic, college basketball's upcoming season, what bubbles might look like. So go check that one out with Brian Bennett. You can catch him on our IU Sports Media YouTube page if you want to see our faces, or you can listen to us in podcast form wherever you get your podcasts under Unpaid Interns. Thanks again to Kyle for coming on. For Kyle Bonagura, I'm Austin Render. We'll be back on Wednesday, but for now, so long from today's episode of Unpaid Interns.